Good morning, guys. I hope that you had a nice long weekend and that you're ready to jump into science today. Today we're going to be starting a new set of notes on weathering, erosion, and deposition. They are attached to the assignment today, so you can feel free to print those and fill them in. If you don't have them to fill in, you will need to write everything that's underlined in today's PowerPoint. So let's get started with our notes. When we talk about weathering, we're talking about a process that breaks down rock and other substances on the Earth's surface. So if you're filling in your printable notes, you're going to find the box that has the giant W, and you're going to write weathering in big letters. And then you're going to fill in that definition for you to have as a reference. You can see these two pictures. We've got on the right-hand side a picture of a giant rock that looks like it's kind of in the middle of a desert, which was probably caused by a little bit of wind erosion. And then on the left-hand side, you've got this little mini clip of a video from the 1950s until 2009 of the coast of Louisiana. And this is showing the weathering, or that breaking down of the land and water flowing over that space instead. And so both of these are kind of good examples of weathering, breakdown of rock. If you're using a highlighter, I would recommend you highlight weathering and then breakdown, because that's literally what weathering means. And the hardest part of this topic is kind of keeping everything on track and straight for your definitions. Now, erosion is the movement of rock particles by wind, water, ice, or gravity. And you're going to write erosion in big letters in your box that's marked with the letter E. Movement is the big word that I want you to associate with erosion. Whether it's by wind or water, like these two pictures show, erosion happens when rock particles are moved. So go ahead, if you're using your highlighter, and highlight movement and erosion. Creep is a particular type of erosion that happens very, very, very slowly. It happens when there's a top layer of soil that's looser than the underlying soil, and so it kind of like ripples and folds sometimes. And you can't even really notice that erosion is happening except for how the trees grow, because the trees are still going to follow the light due to phototropism. And so they're kind of going to get a curve upward, as these trees on the left-hand side did. So you might see this word in some of our questions to come later this week. Now, deposition, just like when we go to deposit something in the bank, we put something in the bank for them to store for us to use later. Deposition happens when silt, sediment, soil, and rock are added to something. So in our box that's marked with a big D, we're going to put deposition in big letters, and then you're going to fill in the rest of your definition. Go ahead and highlight deposition and then added, because we're really adding something to when we have deposition occurring. If you look at the little video clip on the left, you can see that the river that's flowing along the edge right here is adding more and more land to this area. More is being deposited. And so we've got a larger land area at the end than we do at the beginning. Over here, we've had kind of a little rock slide. So rock has fallen in this different shade of color rock and collapsed down the side of this mountain to form this big pile of rocks and sediment, right? So deposition can happen with lots of different types of material. Deltas are something that's often formed by deposition when we have river sediment. Deltas are wetlands, and they empty their water into another body of water, like an ocean or a lake or another river. And so these wetlands form and create really fertile land. And so in areas like the Mississippi Delta of the Mississippi River, you have a lot of farmland that's really productive farmland in the Mississippi Delta. Sometimes deltas can even have alluvial fans. It sounds very fancy, right? Alluvial fans are fan-shaped, but it happens kind of when the river flows from that kind of narrow funnel, and then it kind of spreads outward. So it creates a area of deposition of small sediment in that area. And they call that sediment, a particular type called alluvium. So they call it an alluvial fan because it's made of that sediment from the river. We're going to see if you guys can hear this audio. If it doesn't come through, then I'll post in a separate video. The important thing here is to remember that these three processes work together to wear down and shape the ecoregions of Texas. So you're going to see a little quick clip here of that happening.
changes the shape of rocks over time. What factors cause weathering?
So you got to see some really great examples of weathering in that video, right, of some large spaces that have been weathered. Let's look at those ecoregions for just a second. On your notes, if you were able to print them out, you see that there's a diagram of Texas, and then there's all of these kind of crazy shaped areas. They're not counties, but they are the ecoregions of Texas. And we're going to talk a little bit more about them and how weathering and erosion and deposition affect the life that can live there, the water there, the ecosystems. And all of this is because we have a large amount of land that makes up Texas. And so we have a variety of different types of wildlife and land that can be there. And so each of these different sections in your diagram represent a different section of Texas, and the wildlife and plant life and topography and water and weather that all interact to create that particular ecosystem. So if you look over here on this, all the way on the east side, you may have been to East Texas and seen the pine wood forest there. Those are the piney woods. We've got the Trans-Pecos, which is kind of the desert area in the left. We've got the plains up in the Panhandle. We've got the coastal Gulf Coast prairies and Gulf Coast marshes down here. So we've got a lot of different types of environments that are smaller than a biome, but we're going to talk about them kind of like biomes, right? They have particular types of plants and animal life that are supported by the weather and sunlight and moisture that they receive. Topography, the word I just used to talk about different elevations, has to do with how tall or deep the surface of the land is. And so when we're looking at elevation, if you're looking somewhere like San Antonio, we're more flat, right? It's pretty flat in San Antonio. Kind of go up on that 410 loop and you can see the whole city out in front of you. Whereas if you drive up to Mico or Fredericksburg, more towards the Texas Hill Country, you get a lot more hilly property, right? You've got more elevation. And so topography is how we measure that, how tall or shallow the land is in a particular area. And this affects the type of erosion and weathering and deposition that can happen in an area. If you've got mostly flat land, wind is going to be able to erode that very easily. If you've got a lot of ups and downs and you've got a lot of rivers that flow in these deep valleys, then you might have more water erosion. So topography can make a big difference on the types of erosion, weathering, and deposition that happen in a particular area. And it happens in large areas, right? Some of those ecoregions are pretty large, right? So there's two main types of weathering. We're going to fill this in at the bottom box on the front of your paper. There's mechanical weathering. This is a physical breakdown. This is a physical change. We're not changing the makeup. We're just making the pieces smaller. And there are 5 main types of mechanical weathering. So if you'll flip to the second page of your notes, I can show you the 5 types of mechanical weathering, and then we'll come back to that box about physical. This particular type of weathering is called frost wedging, and this happens when water seeps into cracks in rocks. It's going to freeze, and when water freezes, it expands. You've seen this if you've ever put something in the freezer and left it too long, and it ruptures your bottle, right? Because water, when it's cold, it expands. And so when we have frost wedging, little bits of water get into those cracks, they freeze, they expand, they make a bigger crack, more water seeps in, and this process happens and can eventually form very large cracks in the rocks there. Thermal expansion and contraction happens when rocks expand and cool at different rates, right? Different types of rock are going to expand and cool at different rates. And so if you look somewhere like Enchanted Rock, which is the picture on the right, you can see the cracks in that surface rock. And that happens because of that thermal expansion and contraction. And thermal expansion and contraction, you may have experienced if you ever took a hot plate out of the microwave and set it on your cold counter and the glass ruptures, right, or breaks or shatters. This happens when thermal expansion happens really fast, and then the contraction happens really fast, and the particles can't keep up, and so it cracks the material. This happens on a slower rate when we're looking at it in nature, right? And sometimes thermal expansion and contraction can go together with something like frost wedging, where we're having water seep in, right? Because that's going to also affect it. Rocks normally expand when they're hot, and so when they're cold, they contract. And so it all has to do with what materials and what minerals each of the rocks contains. This particular type of thermal expansion is called exfoliation. This happens when we have layers of rock that kind of break apart. And sometimes rocks, the way that they form, are layered as well. And so that can cause an even quicker rate of weathering to happen when it breaks off in layers. And so you can see the picture on the left and the picture on the right. We've got these layers in the picture on the left that are kind of shedding like skin. And then this one, we've got kind of what looks like a harder material on the outside, and then a softer type of rock on the inside. So you might see that weathering change how that rock looks over the next 100 or 200 years. This type of mechanical weathering happens when we grind away rock by small particles in water or wind, or even by gravity. This is called abrasion. And abrasion happens when rock particles or rock and sand particles hit each other. That's why you often see these along riverbeds, and we even call these river rocks a lot of times, these round, smooth rocks. You maybe even have seen these like in Buc-ee's, where they have all the colorful rocks. Those aren't just, they don't come out of the ground like that. They take broken up rocks and they put them on what's called a tumbler that has lots of small pebbles, and they rotate that tumbler until all of the edges are worn down and smooth. And then you can go and buy them at Buc-ee's, right? And so that abrasion kind of grinds away that rock slowly over a period of time. I'm sure you can see that this type of weathering is caused by something biological. It's caused by either plants or animals that physically change those rock structures. So a seed gets trapped in a little small crevice of a rock. It grows into a tree. As it gets bigger, the force of that tree growing and the roots digging deep are going to force that rock apart to break into smaller particles. Over here, you can kind of see my little armadillo and how armadillos burrow. And sometimes their burrows actually collapse. So they have that hard shell to protect them. And when those burrows collapse, do you think rock's going to change? Yeah, might affect the way that the rock and land is shaped. So that's biological weathering, when it's caused by a living thing. All right, let's see if we can watch this one. Hope the sound comes through for you guys.
Rocks are tough, but nature is tougher. In time, all exposed rock is worn away by wind, water, and other natural forces. The results can be extraordinary. We call the removal of rocky material erosion, whereas weathering refers to the breakdown of rocks into smaller pieces. Weathering is caused by physical, chemical, or biological factors. Physical weathering happens as a result of simple physical processes. Sand carried by the wind scours any exposed surface. Ice forms in tiny cracks and eventually splits rocks apart. In desert regions, rocks expand slightly in the daytime heat, then shrink a little at night. This daily cycle weakens and fragments the surface. And wherever water is on the move, it reshapes the world around it. Water also plays a role in chemical weathering. Rain is naturally acidic because it absorbs atmospheric carbon dioxide. This acidity is increased by oxides of sulfur and nitrogen, pumped out by vehicles and industry. When this rain falls on a soft calcium carbonate rock, such as limestone, the rock is slowly dissolved as the weak acid percolates through, creating cave systems that can stretch miles. Biology plays its part too. The roots of plants find their way into cracks, forcing them open as the plant grows. Sponges, barnacles, and sea urchins all bore into rocky surfaces, while burrowing land animals can do their own damage as they build a home. Even we play a part, as our footsteps wear away the surface of natural pathways.
So he mentioned some types of chemical weathering. So let's look at what chemical weathering is. If you'll flip back to that first page of your notes, chemical weathering actually chemically changes rock or minerals into a different substance. So if we look at this picture of the Statue of Liberty on the left, the Statue of Liberty was originally made of copper. And I actually have a copper penny, just a second. Copper is this color, right? So why does the Statue of Liberty look green? Well, it's because oxidation, the reaction of oxygen, water, and a metal, has caused the Statue of Liberty to rust, right? But we don't call it rust when it's on copper. We call it a patina. And that patina has changed the color of her. And so if we were to remove it, eventually we would wear down the copper so that there was no copper left, because the copper would continue to oxidize in the presence of that water and that oxygen. So if we look at these pictures up here, if we look at this picture of 1944 and then today of this same statue, we notice that there is definitely some weathering that's happened. And here we can see some oxidation that's happening of some iron that is in the ground. So let's look at some factors that cause chemical weathering. Oxidation is caused by oxygen and water and metal meeting up, and it causes rust. And so here we've got rust that has oxidized on some old iron tools, and here we have some iron-containing rock that's close to the beach where there's water, there's wind, there's oxygen, and so that oxygen is causing rust to occur. It's causing that iron to oxidize. And it's not just iron. Other metals like silver and copper can also oxidize and combine with oxygen to create a different substance. Carbonic acid is an acid that occurs when water mixes with carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. And it causes a weak acid that can dissolve stones like limestone or marble. Limestone is one of those stones that we have a lot of here in San Antonio. And so it can actually cause huge caves to form. If you've ever been to the Natural Bridge Caverns, we call that karst topography. It's topography that's created by that chemical reaction between the limestone, which is very basic, and then an acid dissolving that, right? Just like when you mix vinegar and baking soda, we have an acid and a base. When you mix those two together, you get that fizz that shows you a chemical reaction is happening. The same thing can happen in a small scale when we have acid rain or carbonic acid that can dissolve that limestone. A lot of our older tombstones were also made of marble, which is also a very soft stone that can be dissolved by carbonic acid. Acid rain actually forms when burned fossil fuels mix with moisture in the air or in clouds, and they combine in the clouds with that water, and it produces these weak acids: carbonic acid, nitric acid, sulfuric acid. And so we usually get this when there's a lot of pollution. Well, just like with any cloud, when there's too much condensation, it's going to fall to the earth in the form of precipitation, and then that forms as acid rain, right? So it can chemically destroy rocks and plant life. Biochemical weathering we talked a little bit about when we talked about succession, because we talked about those lichens that grow on plants and dissolve the rock and create new soil by secreting acids, which chemically change the rock and break it down. And so this is true of fungi and lichens. And so biochemical weathering can also cause chemical changes that break the rock down and form a new substance, a new soil. Now, If you haven't gotten it already, there's two main factors that affect the rate of weathering. One is the type of rock, right? If we've got a soft rock like limestone or marble, they're more permeable, and so they're going to weather more quickly. They're going to absorb the acid. They're going to absorb the water. They're going to have those pores, which are those small cracks and creases that water can seep into. Climate is also going to be a huge factor. Moist climates are going to weather way more quickly than dry climates, right? Because that moisture, not only does it seep into cracks and physically weather, but we need moisture for most chemical weathering as well, right? Water is that chemical that's necessary for those two. So if we watch this guy, he's trying to shovel his driveway, which is what people do in areas that actually get snow. You have to shovel your driveways and your sidewalks so that kids can walk to school and you can get everywhere. But he keeps running into cracks, right? Because of that frost wedging that's happening in that moist climate, right? He gets a lot of snow and rain, and so water seeps into the cracks in that concrete and creates those larger crevices that then stop him from being able to easily shovel his sidewalk. Here we've got a picture of the Egyptian pyramids. They've weathered really slowly because the climate is so dry. Even the things stored inside the Egyptian pyramids are often really well preserved because of how dry the climate is. Here's the opposite of that. If you've ever been to Cozumel and seen the Mayan ruins, they have a lot more humidity in Cozumel than they do in Egypt. So you're going to see a lot more weathering that's happened to these pyramids than the ones in Egypt. You can see there used to be these kind of steps, these sharp edges that kind of zigzagged all the way down. Now they're just kind of lumpy, right? They've been weathered really extremely with acid rain and just regular rain as well, right, to cause them to weather more quickly. So here's kind of an example of even just how water erosion can have a large effect over a long period of time. So we've got 25 years here. We've got 50 years here. We've got some cute little kids in the background. And then at the beginning is 15 years, right? So you can see the big difference that even a trickle of water can have over a long period of time. Here we have Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore, we carved the faces of some presidents into the sides of these outcrops of the South Dakota mountains, and it was completed in 1941. Is that physical, mechanical weathering, or is it chemical weathering? I hope that you can tell me that it is mechanical because we physically changed the surface of those rocks, right? We chiseled them away to be in the shapes of those faces. How does weathering, erosion, and deposition affect the area where we live? Now, this is what we're going to be focused on when we get to start talking about ecoregions of Texas. Here's a video that we're going to watch about how the Edwards Plateau is affected by weathering and how the ecosystems and water supply are all tied together. You're going to hear the term karst topography. Remember, those are those caves that are formed by limestone being worn away by that carbonic acid or acid rain, and the special types of organisms that live in those karst topography areas. They don't often live in lots of other places. So this kind of ties together a lot of the things that we've been talking about over the last few weeks.
The Edwards Plateau ecoregion is the Texas Hill Country, bordering the rolling plains to the north and the Trans-Pecos to the west. This ecoregion stretches as far south as the border of Mexico and the cities of San Antonio and Austin to the east.
The Edwards Plateau ecoregion is about 24 million acres, or 7,800,000 hectares. It's about the size of West Virginia. Early historical accounts have it as a mid to tall grass prairie with oak savannas, scattered oak trees throughout, with hardwoods and some ash juniper on the bottoms, and what we call the drainages or the gullies.
The Edwards Plateau is transected by a number of rivers, sinkholes, caves, and rocky outcroppings. This karst topography hosts some of the most specialized species in the world.
The Edwards Plateau is known internationally across the globe for its karst topography. Endemic species that are found here, the golden-cheeked warbler, for example, only nests in Texas. The cave-dwelling species, from the invertebrates to the bat communities that we have, are truly amazing.
Just northwest of San Antonio, Bracken Cave is said to host over 20 million Mexican free-tailed bats, noted as the largest concentration of mammals at any one cave in the world. The Edwards Plateau also supports much smaller species like the federally endangered Barton Springs salamander near Austin. Parched habitats and the species that inhabit them are extremely vulnerable for several reasons. Number one, due to their extreme locality. They may be abundant in one location and not found anywhere else. They're also highly vulnerable due to water quality issues. Many of the species that exist in these karst environments are dependent upon pure water. And this water may be polluted from a city that may be miles and miles away.
As new housing developments sprawl beyond the suburbs and into the Texas Hill Country, the resulting land fragmentation is gradually decreasing wildlife habitats.
The Edwards Plateau is one of the fastest growing areas in the nation. People are moving in from all over the country. They find land prices cheaper in this area than they would in their home states. Problem is that we're breaking up large historical ranches into smaller and smaller pieces.
Creating urban-like neighborhoods in the Hill Country often brings with it urban land use practices. Some of those practices can produce damaging ripple effects for wildlife.
The fragmentation's bad enough, but when they go in and clear off all the native species and put introduced species, plant species in, there's no utilization by wildlife. When that happens, the wildlife that is there is pushed out into smaller and smaller habitats. Therefore, overcrowding, overpopulations result. We've got a tremendous overpopulation of white-tailed deer.
Unfortunately, white-tailed deer aren't very discriminating in their tastes and will eat just about anything from ground level up to about 5 feet. And that completely eliminates the understory vegetation for other wildlife to use. When they do that, they prevent the forest from regenerating itself. And lots of different species require that understory in order to nest or roost. We have the same issue with allowing livestock to overgraze an area. With overgrazing, we see a change in the habitat. We see brush starting to grow like mesquite and ash juniper, and we see erosion begin.
Along with impacts of an increased deer population and overgrazing by livestock, the absence of natural fire has also contributed to brush growth in the Edwards Plateau.
That fire kept the brush species suppressed. When modern man, early settlers moved in, the suppression of fire caused increase in brush species. That, along with introduction of livestock on the Edwards Plateau, both cattle, sheep, and goats, they took out the grasses. Erosion happened at an alarming rate. Ash juniper is the winner, so to say. It just basically outcompetes. Ash juniper offers very little in the way of a food source. There are a few songbirds that take its seed and that help spread it, obviously. It offers shelter for all wildlife species, some nesting substrate. Obviously, golden cheek warbler depend on its shredding bark of the mature ash juniper for their nesting materials. But what we call second growth cedar, or the cedar under 10, 12, 14 feet, is what we consider the invasive plants.
Uncontrolled growth of cedar has hydrological impacts as well.
The thing about cedar trees is that they've been shown to intercept a tremendous amount of moisture from the atmosphere when it rains. And they evapotranspire this moisture back into the atmosphere. And what that means is rainfall that used to penetrate the ground no longer penetrates the ground when you have a heavy cover of cedar trees.
By removing dense areas of cedar, landowners can lessen the strain on the Edwards Aquifer, the region's largest groundwater supply. Two bird species hardest hit by this continued urban sprawl in the Edwards Plateau are the golden-cheeked warbler and the black-capped vireo.
The golden-cheeked warbler is listed as an endangered species because of land fragmentation, loss of habitat, the cutting of mature ash juniper by early settlers, deciduous hardwoods, the oaks have been cleared in some areas for agricultural practices, and land fragmentation development. We're losing many, many acres to land development, people moving out into the Edwards Plateau. The black-capped vireo is a unique species. It's about 4 inches tall. The males are real distinct black color on their head and striping with a greenish yellow body with gray tones mixed in. It's a songbird. They come here in March and set up their territories. The males can be found singing throughout the nesting season.
With continued development in the Edwards Plateau, protecting habitats for the golden-cheeked warbler and the black-capped vireo is a priority.
The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, along with the other non-governmental organizations and agencies, both federal and state, have done an excellent job of educating landowners and developers in what is golden cheek warbler habitat and what is not, and doing all we can to minimize those impacts. Habitat conservation plans offset or mitigate for the damages done to golden cheek warbler habitat and in some instances black-capped vireo habitat also. There are numerous land trust and conservation easement holders throughout the Edwards Plateau. Without these, public lands just wouldn't be able to recover a species or maintain a population of species on its own.
Cooperation and partnerships between private landowners and conservation professionals will continue to be a priority for ensuring the availability of existing and future habitats for fish and wildlife in the Edwards Plateau.
One of the most important things we can do for the Edwards Plateau is that we can monitor our grazing regimes and incorporate those techniques that will best preserve the prairies that are in the Edwards Plateau. One of these management techniques could be the high-intensity, low-frequency rotation system. The benefit of that is that wild grasses are well adapted to occasional grazing. They're not well adapted to continuous grazing. So by breaking up that grazing intensity, you can really increase the value of your grasslands to wildlife.
Our population is expected to double in the next 20 to 30 years. With all that being said, we see the bright side to the Edwards Plateau and the wildlife species that are dependent on it. Everything that's been put in the Texas Wildlife Action Plan is to benefit species throughout the Edwards Plateau. The implementation of this plan by both Texas Parks and Wildlife Department personnel, all the other individuals involved, the landowners, the consultants, the federal agencies, all will see the benefits to the wildlife species throughout the plateau.